Our objective for this lesson is to analyze intertextuality between two texts by examining a global issue, a concept, and stylistic techniques. So intertextuality can take on two meanings. In the first bullet point, you see it's an author's borrowing and transformation of a prior text by using allusions, parody, pastiche, and appropriation. And that's how we looked at it last spring. All right. So it can either be a writer's borrowing, or it can be how a reader is referencing one text to another. And that, at the end of the day, is what the IB oral commentary, the individual oral wants you to do. All right. So this is coming from your classroom website. So to bring it into the context of your individual oral, which is one of your main IAs, the prompt asks you to examine the ways in which the global issue of your choice is presented through the content and form of two of the works that you have studied. So the content and form part, that's a loaded phrase there, and you don't have to worry about it at this point, but I'm trying to get you of the mindset that this is why we are looking at two texts for this purpose, because at the end you have to produce this oral commentary that's 10-minute conversation with me, your teacher. All right, so we're going to look at two texts today. Just to preview, we're going to look at a political cartoon which was published 2 days after 9/11 by a famous cartoonist known as Jim Moran. So in this class, we are going to look at political cartoons just by this illustrator alone, because IB wants you to focus on one type of illustrator. So every time we look at a political cartoon, it's always coming from the same source. All right, we're going to talk about all these things in a minute. And then the second text that we are looking at is coming from page 14. And again, what I'm going to do here is make connections between how a global issue is evident in both of these texts. And I have to talk about, like it says here, the content and form. All right. So all of this is content and form, by the way. Like IB uses fancy language, but all of this is content and form that I've identified here. Okay. You are going to take reader's notes as I explain the main three aspects of text that we look at. I'm going to start with a global issue. All right. So be ready to take those notes. This is going to get transferred in your learner portfolio eventually. This is like part of your weekly assignment, but you can take notes here because it's a lot easier to do it this way. All right, I'm going to talk about the concept and, of course, stylistic techniques. And you can see above which ones I've identified. So if I want to look at this as a global issue, I can look at it in many different ways. All right. I am going to focus on this as terrorism as a form of hard power, and for the reasons that I'll indicate as I'm presenting. So, like I said, it's important to look at the context, which is the background of a piece of text, as you are introducing it and explaining it in this oral commentary that you will deliver. All right. So, it's important to note that 2 days after 9/11, this illustration was published. What was going on in society during this time? Well, obviously, our Twin Towers had been bombed, right? And then as a result, Bush reacted. This was President Bush at the time. He reacted by eliminating civil liberties in the name of this hard power that he had. He waged war against terrorism in the name of freedom. All right. So our freedoms were also being taken away. What came about at that time was this Patriot Act, where everything was being watched and surveillance. If you really read carefully, for example, the contract on your iPhones or Galaxies, it says that the government has the right to monitor your activity on that device. Okay. And this came about as a result of the Patriot Act. A lot of people didn't know that at the time, right? and weren't aware of it unless, like, I took a class and learned about that. So, but they're not going to put that information out for people to know. So your civil liberties are being like taken away and eliminated because of this Patriot Act. So as you can see, we have the Statue of Liberty here, right? A form of power. I'm sorry, a form of freedom. All right. So keep that in the back of your mind. So global issue again, terrorism is hard power. You can just indicate that. All right. Concept. So whenever I look at a political cartoon, I think, okay, this communication, because the political cartoonist is communicating a message through their illustration. You can also argue that the writer's communicating his or her perspective. Um, Perspective, since it's political, it's going to be either, and I'm not going to look at this as Republican or liberal or whatever here. That's not what we're doing with this. But it is a type of perspective, right? Okay. So that concept again for your notes is communication, right? And more in particular, how the political cartoonist communicates the message through their illustration. So we're going to look at that through stylistics, because political cartoons have a lot of stylistics. And I've identified like the top three. You will see these in virtually every single political cartoon. And we're going to look at more political cartoons in the context of what we're reading throughout the course of the year. Okay, the first thing that we want to look at is imagery. All right. So images, immediately, most political cartoons have imagery of like lightness and darkness, for example. Here you see the shadow in the background. Shadow indicates darkness and possibly evil. And then you have this, of course, the Statue of Liberty holding that torch there. All right. So that's an example of imagery there for your notes. When you get to symbolism, the symbol, obviously, is the Statue of Liberty, right? It's an object that represents an idea. That idea is freedom and liberty, like it says over here on the bottom of her podium. Okay, so that's basically what the symbolism is there. Okay, and then we are going to get to irony. Many political cartoons convey irony. Well, the irony, as you can see, is we have an object here, right? We have a symbol that represents freedom. However, on the flip side of that, these here are not freedoms. And again, this is a result of this Patriot Act that came about when Bush was president. Like all of these freedoms were being taken away by the Patriot Act. Okay, so I've rewritten what is on this pedestal here for you to get a better idea of how this is not freedom. So if you read, give me your metal detectors, your frisks, your luggage searches, your ID spot checks, your scared people yearning to feel safe. Not freedom there, right? Okay, so that kind of puts this political cartoon into perspective as far as the issue of terrorism as hard power, or you can say the global issue is freedom too. Like you can look at it another way too, depending on how you talk about it. Concept, communication, again, to review, like what is being communicated and how is that being communicated. Okay, so the big concept here is communication. And then your stylistics, again, in your notes, identify the imagery, identify the symbolism, and also indicate what is ironic here. This is really important, especially because artists use style, right? And they use techniques to communicate their message. Okay, so enough with that. So after you've taken your notes, obviously, you'll be able to explain this in what I'm asking you to do here. I'm going to go on to the second text and show you the intertextuality between the two texts right now. Okay, again, I've highlighted and I've underlined. And if you look, there's a lot of green here. there are a lot, several, many global issues presented in this particular, IB calls these extracts, portions of text, right? When we're reading text like this, you don't necessarily have to read from beginning to end to understand ideas. Here we're talking about, so obviously the context is the war, right? Against Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda that the author is referring to, she's referring to. So if you think about what I just told you about this idea of, look at these civil liberties are being taken away here, right? This is it. This is the irony here. Here's the intertextuality here because the ideas are coming together and connecting. So his efforts, meaning Bush's, to eliminate civil liberties such as legal and due processes, and these are ideas, again, what I'm underlining here, this is all being conveyed in this part of the political cartoon here, if you go back and reread it. Some of it is explicit, some of it is more implicit, like you have to make those connections. Okay, so legal and due processes puts many of us in danger of terrorist attacks from our own government. Ooh, okay. So this is where I'm seeing the hard power here, right? Because this is a type of coercion and control, terrorist attacks from our own government. Now that's a scary thought if you think about it, our own government. And she's absolutely right about that. Like if you were living during that time period, like today, it was a very scary time period. So attacks on activist organizations violate the First Amendment, giving us the right to advocate for change and guaranteeing free speech. And free speech is even mentioned. I'm going to go back up here in this political cartoon. Okay. All right. So free speech, illegal searches and seizures. Okay, this one is more directly implied. The searches and seizures over here, as you can see, your luggage searches, right? That's what's there. Okay, they violate the Fourth Amendment, and being forced to answer the FBI's or INS's questions violate the Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. When people are jailed without being charged and are indefinitely detained, the land becomes a police state, invasive with security checks and surveillance. So again, I think when you look at police state, like that's a form of hard power. Checks and surveillances, like people have control over people's lives. Like that's not good. Checks, surveillances, well, here we go. Surveillance, metal detectors, frisks, right? All that stuff is there. Okay. Another global issue, like this text presents a lot of global issues, but at the end of the day, you just have to say, okay, I'm focusing on one. And you can do that even though there's layers of global issues like in this particular text. So she's talking about racialized language leads to racial profiling. Here's communication right here. Like this is a global issue. And you can say racialized language is a problem in society. It's a problem not just here, but like all over the planet. It just doesn't happen here. All right, so it leads to targeting dark-skinned, Middle Eastern-looking, and other people of color earmarked as potential terrorists, so that white Americans can keep their illusions of safety and entitlement unmarred. Our government sets up oppressive measures such as racial profiling. When I see the word oppressive, I'm like, ooh, heavy, deep stuff here. Another form of power here. Makes people of color feel disposable, perpetually unsafe, and torn apart like Koyo Sokwi. Here again, she brings in this powerful symbol of the past. Torn apart. So I'm like, symbol, okay, that was her, that was her idea of apartness, right? And fragmentation. And the Statue of Liberty kind of almost represents the same thing. Like you can take that to, on a symbolic level there. Bush's I'm going to talk about what I have here in yellow as far as irony goes, this idea of safety, because she has it in quotes and she indicates illusions of safety up above. All right, so when you have something in quotes, it's like, okay, this is not really what it's supposed to be. Okay, so let me just read this and then I'll explain this. Safety as being a form of irony. So Bush's attempts to make this country safe from terrorism endanger some of our residents. Under martial law, we would lose most of our rights. And again, like what I've underlined in red is like directly implied in the political cartoon. Like that's the connection there. That's the intertextuality I'm trying to get you to understand. So last thing I wanted to say was this idea of safety. She talks about illusions of safety. Um, well, guess what? It's ironic here because like we're not safe, like especially when we wage war. Like people are going to be upset with us, especially Middle Eastern cultures, because we are targeting the race in the name. At the end of the day, I'm bringing this back to my global issue in the name of protecting our borders, and acknowledging that terrorism is indeed hard power. Like our terrorism, if you think about it, our terrorism on these people, like we're terrorizing just by waging war, right? We didn't need to be there. A lot of Americans felt that that was unnecessary. Any kind of war is unnecessary, but ever since the beginning of time, countries have been engaged in wars for the wrong reasons, in the name of these types of powers. All right, so that concludes today's lesson. What you're doing again is you're looking at two types of text to review, right? And you're looking at what global issue, like first you have to say what global issue is conveyed in these two texts, right? You can argue and say, okay, the terrorism, right? This idea of threats to borders, or also you can take it from the perspective of freedoms and liberties, because that's also a global issue too. Concept again was communication, and three powerful stylistic techniques that you're going to see like in almost every single political cartoon are right there. Okay. Thank you for listening.